So in yesterday's web dev tip, we set up an array of allowed URLs that we're going to allow participants of our Rickroll app to send people to, but we need to display that to the user when they're actually creating a new Rickroll URL so they can actually choose one of those options. So in this tutorial, we're going to actually display those URLs to the user, but we're not just going to hard code them into our HTML. We're going to take the array that we created yesterday from our common definitions package and then just generate the options in a select box for the front end to display. So we're going to start off by adding a select box into our markup, and we'll give this an ID. We'll say the ID is selected target, for example. So this is going to be a drop-down list that will show all of the titles from the allowed URLs, and the value will be the URL itself, and that will make a bit more sense in just a moment. But at the moment, if we just go back to our app, you can see we've just got an empty select box there. So we're going to populate that with our JavaScript or TypeScript using the array that we created yesterday. So in our main.ts, we've already added the allowed URLs from our common definitions. If you do see any errors on the console, you might just need to restart the server for the front end app. That happened to me when I was just setting this up. And we're going to take those allowed URLs and generate some options within that select box that we just created. So I'm going to break this out into a new function just to keep it separate and also in case we need to reuse it at any point as well. So we'll say something like map allowed URLs to options. Okay, say options, and this is just going to be a function here, and we're going to take two things. We're going to take the array of URLs to make it a bit more flexible rather than just referencing this import up here. So we'll say the URLs, and I'm going to type that to be an array of the allowed URL. So that's just been imported from the common definitions package. And we also want the element that we want to apply this to. So we're going to say the HTML select element is the name of the variable, the argument that we're passing in. And I'm also going to type that, as we're in TypeScript here, and that'll be a HTML select element. And this is just going to be a function, as I mentioned. And all we're going to do in here is take that array of URLs and loop through them. So we'll say for each URL. Oops, and something's going wrong there. It's not really an arrow function. I'm trying to assign this to an object, which isn't going to work. So for each of those URLs, we're going to get the option URL is one of the allowed URLs from the array that's been passed in. And for each of those URLs, what we're going to do is we're going to create a new option HTML element. So we'll say, let's create a variable called option, and we'll say document.create element, and it's going to be of type option. So if you're not familiar with your HTML and your form tags, inside of the select tag, we need to have lots of different options to give the user. So that's just what we're creating automatically with our TypeScript code here. So we've just created one of those options, but we need to set some values on it. So the first thing is we want to set the actual value that is applied to the option when the user selects that from the select box. And that will be taken from the option URL, which is this argument up here. And because we're using TypeScript and because we typed the allowed URLs array yesterday as well, we've got the option to select the properties from that. So we want to take the URL itself. So that's what we're actually going to send to the back end eventually. And we also want to set the text content of the option tag as well. So this is going to be the thing that the user sees inside of the markup and on the page. And we're going to set that text content equal to the option URL title. So if you remember from yesterday, this is what the array of allowed URLs looks like. So the URL is going to be where we're sending the user to, and the title is just something so the user can see what they're selecting. So with that option created, we just need to append it to the HTML select element variable that we're passing in, and we'll just say append child and then pass in that option. So this function will basically take all of the allowed URLs, generate options for each of them, and then append it into the select element on the page. So we need to do a couple of things now. We need to call this function, but first we need to actually select that element on the page, as we have done with lots of other things within our TypeScript code so far. So we'll say the selected target is equal to document.get element by ID, and the name of that, I believe we put in the markup, was selected target. So we'll just use that to select the element. Let's remove that. And once we've got a reference to that select element, we can call our function because we've got both bits of information there now. So we're going to say map URLs to options, just copy that there and call it. And we need to call it with the allowed URLs that we've imported from our common definitions package, and we also need to pass in the selected target as well. Now you'll see TypeScript's going to give us a bit of a problem there because it doesn't know what type of element we've selected, and it's expecting a HTML select element. So we can just use the as keyword here to say when you select the selected target HTML element, just make sure that that is a select element within the TypeScript code. So if we save that now, what that should do is it should run the function to map those URLs to options when we load the page. And you can see when we go back to the web app, we've got some options populated into our select box, and we can select a different one of those before we click the Create Rickroll button. So just before we finish up, let's style that because it doesn't really fit in line with what we've got there at the moment. So let's go over to our styles.scss, and just underneath the button here, we'll say all the select elements within our hero section here. We'll say give them a bit of padding and also set the font weight to be 700 to give it a slightly bolder color. So now if we go back, you can see that the select box looks a bit more like the button, and we could play around with that. We could make it slightly wider than the create button, but for now we'll just leave it as it is, with the user being able to select a different option before they press the Create Rickroll button. Okay, so the user can still go ahead and do that, but it doesn't actually do anything at the moment because we're not actually referencing the select element before we actually make our post to the API. So you can see down here in the network request that we've just sent, you can see, although it's working okay, we're not actually sending any data to the backend service. So in the next tutorial, we'll actually pick out the value that the user's chosen and make sure that gets sent to the API with our post request. But that's it for this tutorial. Make sure you stay tuned for more web dev tips.